and over time the buyer would pay off the bond, and that's exactly what happened. However, in 1776, the Revolution started. Virginia issued paper money. They made it legal tender, and the purchasing power of that paper money approached zero. And the people who owed Jefferson the money on the bonds paid him off with the worthless paper money. However, Jefferson still owed the 20,000 pounds to the financiers in Britain, and in his whole life he was never able to work his way out of that debt. He died a bankrupt, and in fact, de facto bankrupt. And in fact, along the way, the Congress tried to help him out. He had a lot of books. They bought his books for $15,000. That became the Library of Congress. So when Jefferson said that the paper money was a cheat, he wasn't talking about it from some theoretical ground. He had actually been cheating, as had all of the other gentry in Virginia, including Madison and Washington. Madison was a large plantation owner. He saw the Revolution coming. He had leased his land, and the people to whom he leased it paid him off with the worthless money, and similarly for George Washington. And so when they went to the Constitutional Convention, by now Jefferson is the ambassador to France. When they came up to they weren't supposed to write the Constitution. They were supposed to amend the Articles of Confederation, which were thought to be defective because it didn't give the government the power to tax. When they got to the part about issuing paper money, they debated it, and they overwhelmingly voted it down, which is why Article 1, Section 8 says they give the government the power to coin money. There is no power to issue paper money. You go to the next slide, slide number 23, and here in Article 1, Section 10, and this is what your bill today is based on, it says no state shall coin money, emit bills of credit, that's issue paper money, or make anything but gold and silver a tender in payment of debt. So there can be no doubt that the money of our country, as manifested by the Constitution, is gold and silver. Go to the next slide, please. And this is an example of the money that was used. And go to the next slide, please. We're up to slide 25. This changed at the time of the Civil War. The Civil War, as you may know, was a very unpopular war. Lincoln had trouble financing it. He instituted a tariff called the Murrell Tariff. It was 47%. Didn't raise enough money. He instituted income tax. People rejected it. And he couldn't borrow the money because it would have popped interest rates to 14%. Some people say as much as 30%. Had that happened, the value of bonds would have gone down. The banking system in those days, they were chock full of bonds that would have bankrupted the banking industry. So if you can't borrow the money and you can't tax the money, what do? And Lincoln had this very brilliant Secretary of the Treasury. His name was Salmon Chase. He said, well, we'll just print it. And you see in the example of the money they printed, they were called greenbacks. You see Salmon Chase's picture in the upper left-hand side. He was a very brilliant attorney, one time an aspirant to be president himself. And how do you get people to accept the paper money when they're expecting gold or silver? And the answer is they made it legal tender. Now, I don't know if you can read the bottom of the bill there. It says this is the legal tender. Now, legal tender, you will recall, is not something that was given to the government. They didn't have the power to issue legal tender. And as you might imagine, this caused a lot of controversy. There's a lot of litigation. And then after the Civil War, Salmon Chase is now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice. And these legal tender cases percolate up to him, and it's up to him to decide whether or not what he did was proper. And in the first case that came before him is called the Hepburn versus Griswold case. He said there is no legal tender power. He said we printed this money out of necessity as a war measure, and he struck down legal tender. However, then there was another case that came up, and now there were two vacancies on the Supreme Court. They were filled with two railroad attorneys. The railroads wanted to pay off in the paper money, and now they said there is a legal tender power, not based on anything that was in the Constitution, but because they said other countries can do it. And so they said if other countries can do it, we can do it. And go to the next slide, please. And here, Salmon Chase, he wrote down the dissenting opinion, and this is very important. He says the legal tender quality of money is valuable only for the purpose of dishonesty. So here you have the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, brilliant attorney, knew all about the issue, tells you that if you have legal tender money, it is dishonest. And go to the next slide, please. And in our day, the guys who create the money in our system, there's a Federal Reserve note. It's a $10,000 bill. It's a legal tender note. and they have the effrontery to put Salmon Chase's picture on it. And go to the next slide, slide 28. There was one group of people throughout the whole century that were very good on this issue, and that was organized labor. And they said no legal tender law is necessary ever to cause men to make good money. It only uses to make them take bad money, kick it out. And at the end of the century, they asked the exact right questions. They said, if the money's good, why do we need legal tender? And if the money's not good, why should it be legal tender? Well, then in 1874, the resumption legislation took effect. We're back on gold and silver. And go to the next slide. By the way, you'll notice, by the way, when you see gold coins from that period, they're all in pristine condition. And I'll say why in just a minute. The only place where gold coins actually circulated was in California. And you'll see why just right now. And go to the next slide. I want to talk now about fraudulent behavior by banks. And go to slide number 31. Now, even though gold is the money, gold and to a lesser extent silver did not circulate. And there are 4 reasons for this. And now we get to some, which I think is a very interesting part of this presentation. The fact is, gold is a very soft metal, and so if you had gold coins and passed them around, eventually the gold would wear out, you'd lose the value of the coin. Secondly, it's very heavy. It's 19 times heavier than water. So if you had a bunch of gold coins in your pocket, at some point your pocket would rip, you'd lose the coins. Thirdly, they're too valuable for small purchases. You couldn't buy lunch, say, with a small coin. And finally, they're liable to be stolen. The remedy for that, and go to the next slide, please, is that people would bring their gold to a safe place, usually a bank where there would be a vault, and they would get a certificate that looks like this. Now, this is a United States Treasury certificate, and it's not $20. What it certifies is that $20 of gold has been deposited, and if you can see under where it says gold coin, it says payable to the bearer on demand. It is not $20, it's a promise to pay $20. Not the same thing. However, when people got these bills and passed them around, they did not go to the bank to redeem them for their gold. Why would they do that? I mean, what would you do with the gold once you got it? And so what happened, and go to the next slide, please, is that when people would go to banks to borrow money, the banks would give them gold certificates or silver certificates for which they did not have the gold. And the jargon for this is called fractional reserve lending, and this is flat out dishonest. And this is where this whole business about reserves come up. But in fact, the banks really, right from the get-go, are engaged in a dishonest practice. And go to the next slide, please. And this system, by the way, is called the gold standard. We are not proposing the gold standard. We're not in favor of the gold standard. It's an invention which is not authorized by a constitution that's redeemable back, pegged to, somehow linked to gold. It's an invitation to fraud, and it's not authorized by the Constitution. So this system, where the banks would issue receipts for gold for which they did not have gold, this has been going on for a long time. From time to time, individual banks would get caught and be runs on the bank. But as a practical matter, it wasn't such a big deal for ordinary people. And the reason is, with some exceptions, bank officers and directors were personally liable to deposits. So if their bank went bust, their houses, everything they owned was on the line, so they were careful with how they did this. But then, go to the next slide, please. You had a major banking panic in the Northeast. It was called the Panic of 1907. And here, it was a regional panic. And here, J.P. Morgan came to the rescue. He raised a whole bunch of money to allow most of the banks to meet the obligations to depositors. But then there were 4 words that just terrified the whole banking community. And the 4 words were, well, what if he dies? Well, who's going to save us then? And this became the impetus for the Federal Reserve. And here's the stated purpose of the Federal Reserve: to furnish elastic currency. Is that like an elastic measuring rod? Is this something that can conceivably be authorized by the Constitution? And to create a means to reduce discounting commercial paper and establish supervision. So the idea was that if they had supervision, like they're telling us today, if they just supervised it better, that you wouldn't have these panics, because you know what happened with the Great Depression. And as part of this legislation, which was passed in December of 1913, the Federal Reserve was authorized to issue Federal Reserve notes. Go to the next slide, 36.